Before Hoodlum was a film, it was history. A story born from the blood and ambition that shaped Harlem in the 1930s. Long before Hollywood dramatized it in 1997, the Harlem Numbers War was a brutal struggle for power between Dutch Schultz's Jewish mob and the black policy kings and queens who built Harlem's underground economy, the Numbers Racket, or policy as it was known on the streets. What began as a fight for money and territory quickly became a story about power, corruption, and who truly owned Harlem. The Numbers Racket was Harlem's daily lottery, a street corner economy where anyone could bet a penny on a 3-digit number between 0 and 999. The odds were 999 to 1, but the game only paid 600 to 1. It was the worst bet in the world, rigged so heavily in the banker's favour that even the greediest casino in history would have blushed. From the crowded tenements of central Harlem to the brownstone parlours of Sugar Hill, that promise of hope, that one chance in 1,000, kept the poor chasing a fortune. The winning numbers weren't drawn out of a hat, they came from the racetracks. Policy bankers used the parimutuel payouts from horse races at places like Coney Island and Belmont Park to decide that day's winning numbers. In a parimutuel betting system, all stakes go into one shared pool. There's no fixed odds. The value of each winning ticket depends entirely on how much money has been collected and how many people backed the winning horse. For example, if 50 people bet $20, the pool totals $1,000. Now imagine only 10 of those 50 bettors picked the winning horse. In that case, the entire $1,000 pool is divided among those 10 winning tickets, giving each bettor a return of $100 from their original $20 stake. They noted the total amount paid out after the 3rd, 5th and 7th races, then used the 3rd digit from each figure to form the number drawn that night. If the parimutuel payouts totaled $215 after the 3rd race, $568 after the 5th race, and $845 after the 7th, Harlem's winning number for that day was 585. Because the results were printed daily in the daily racing form, anyone could verify them for themselves, and it made Harlem's illegal lottery feel official because it was tied to real horse races and, in the eyes of many, almost legitimate. And the money poured in. By 1931, Harlem's major policy banks was grossing $35,000 a day, which is around $750,000 in today's money. Lucky players took home roughly $7,700, which was barely 20% of the total. The rest flowed upwards to the bankers, numbers, collectors, and police. Even slot machines paid out more generously. The numbers game was the perfect con. Endless profit drawn from people who could least afford to lose. As Prohibition came to an end in 1933, Dutch Schultz's beer empire began to dry up. The man who'd made millions flooding New York with bootleg liquor suddenly found his fortune slipping away. During the height of Prohibition, Schultz had controlled every single drop of liquor in the Bronx, earning him the nickname the Beer Baron of the Bronx. His breweries, trucks and speakeasies formed a criminal empire that stretched to the very edge of Harlem. And when the taps finally ran dry, he needed a new racket. With his Bronx territory bordering the area, Schultz turned his attention to Harlem's numbers game. A business that was rich, unprotected, and run by people who weren't built for violence. He crossed the Harlem River with his gunmen, moving south from the Bronx into a world that had never seen his kind of brutality. He began extorting the leading policy bankers, forcing them to pay for his protection. Men like Casper Holstein, who ran his operation from the Turf Club at 111 West 136th Street, gave in quickly. Alex Pompez, who managed his bank from his cigar shop at 2247 7th Avenue, and Henry Miro, whose operation ran out of 157 West 117th Street, also surrendered to the Dutchman and his reputation for murder. But as her male counterpart succumbed to Dutch's pressure, one banker refused. The feared and extravagant Madame Stephanie St. Clair, known unanimously across Harlem as the Queen of Policy, and her enforcer, Bumpy Johnson, who was, without a doubt, the most feared man in Harlem. From their stronghold at 117 West 141st Street, they stood defiant, and it was there when they said no to the Dutchman that Harlem's numbers racket truly began. In 1997, Bill Duke directed Hoodlum and brought this war to the screen for the very first time, with Tim Roth portraying the ruthless, bloodthirsty Dutch Schultz and Clarence Williams III as his Harlem enforcer, Bob Hulet. Opposite them stood Cicely Tyson as the majestic Madam Queen of Policy, Stephanie St. Clair, and Lawrence Fishburne as Bumpy Johnson, a man who would become the godfather of Harlem and a man who led her war against the Dutchman. But the truth was even more powerful than the film. Long before Schultz ever set foot in Harlem, Madame Stephanie St. Clair had built her empire from the ground up, running the city's most successful policy bank and wielding a level of power that few women in America had ever achieved. Stephanie wasn't about to just let an outsider take over what she had built, and with Bumpy at her side, they refused to bow when all the other policy bankers in Harlem surrendered to the Dutchman's pressure. The standoff between them ignited into a bloody 2-year war that left roughly 40 men dead before the smoke finally cleared. The real numbers war was more than just a gang feud. It was a battle between two worlds, one that had built its own economy out of necessity, and one that sought to exploit it. It was a war about race, class and power, and it would reshape Harlem forever. Because before Hoodlum was a film, it was a war for money, for dominance, and for Harlem's soul. This is the story of that war between the Jewish mob and Harlem's policy bankers, but first, to understand the war in more detail, we need some history on the policy and on Harlem itself. Long before Harlem's streets pulsed with jazz and neon, before men like Bumpy or Dutch ever even learned the word policy, the numbers game had already become a fixture of American city life. Its story began in the early 19th century, in a New York City that was loud, filthy, and addicted to gambling. In those years, lotteries were everywhere. Colonial governments had long used them to fund roads, churches, and schools. By 1827, New York boasted nearly 200 licensed lottery officers, and to the working poor, they represented the only chance at a sudden fortune. A stranger might suppose one half of the citizens get their living from affording the opportunity of gambling to the rest, a reporter for the Evening Post observed with a touch of sarcasm. But as with all forms of easy money, corruption crept in. The drawing of the numbers were often rigged, prizes vanished, and middlemen lined their pockets. When the state finally outlawed lotteries in 1834, New Yorkers didn't stop gambling, they simply went underground. And that's where the policy game was born. It began as a crude form of lottery insurance. Players would choose a combination of 3 numbers and place a tiny wager that those numbers would appear in that day's drawing from out-of-state lotteries like Delaware or Jersey. When telegraphs brought the winning numbers into Manhattan each afternoon, the policymen paid out. You could stake a penny or a nickel, sometimes even on credit, and if you hit, your reward could equal a week's wages. For the city's poorest citizens, it was hope disguised as arithmetic, a way to dream in digits when real opportunity was out of reach. By the 1840s, policy shops had become a fixture of New York's backstreets, narrow rooms lit by gas lamps, with chalkboards listing yesterday's winning numbers and clerks bent over ledgers that were never quite balanced. The air was thick with smoke and sweat, and the talk was always about luck. Dock workers, washerwomen, freedmen and recent immigrants all crowded in for a chance at a miracle. In a city divided by race and class, policy was the one game that didn't ask questions. Anyone with a coin could play. The authorities called it the lowest, meanest, worst form of gambling, but their outrage was hollow. The same politicians who condemned the game collected envelopes from the men who ran it, and none ran it more successfully than Al Adams, the man the papers would crown the policy king of New York City. Adams started small, running numbers out of cigar shops in the 1870s. He was a bookmaker by trade. He was pragmatic and ruthlessly efficient. Whilst others relied on charm and bluster, Adams built a system. He standardised odds, paying at 600 to 1, and organised a network of agents who handled every borough. He kept ledgers like a bank and enforced discipline like a corporation. What had once been a street hustle became, under Adams, an invisible industry generating millions of dollars each year. He bribed police captains, funded ward politicians, and made himself indispensable to the city's underworld. His offices ran with the precision of Wall Street, clerks tabulated bets, runners carried sacks of coins, and every night the day's take was quietly delivered to Adams's headquarters. By the 1890s, his influence stretched from 14th Street to Harlem. Reformers called him the biggest man in the business, and even the Lexo Committee, the era's great corruption inquiry, acknowledged that Adams had the most money, the most protection, and the most power. When he was finally arrested in 1903, police estimated he was earning $1 million a year, around $36 million today, all from policy. Yet even then, he lived like a respectable gentleman. While awaiting sentencing, he stayed not in a jail cell, but at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, receiving visitors in silk dressing gowns, which proved that the envelopes he was passing around were definitely thick. His sentence, which was barely a year in Sing Sing, was a symbolic victory for reformers, but it changed nothing. Adams emerged claiming to be reformed, dabbling in real estate and mining investments, before gambling his whole fortune away and ending his own life in 1906 with a revolver in his suite at the Astoria Hotel. He was 61 years old. The New York Times obituary noted that the king was dead, but his kingdom had endured. Among the men who kept it alive was Peter H. Matthews, a man of whom no photograph survived, but he was one of Al Adams's most trusted lieutenants. Unlike Adams though, Matthews was a black man who was born and raised in Harlem, and he understood both sides of the city, the polished corruption of downtown politics and the raw hunger of uptown streets. With Adams's death, Matthews quietly inherited his kingdom and carried it north into his own community, introducing the policy game to the streets of Harlem. By the 1910s, Harlem was changing beyond recognition. The neighborhood that would one day be called the Black Capital of America had once been something very different indeed, a quiet Dutch farming village. In the 1600s, when New York was still New Amsterdam, Dutch settlers claimed the northern reaches of Manhattan for themselves, naming the area Nieuw Haarlem after the city in the Netherlands where many of the settlers had come from. The land was vast and pastoral, rolling hills, streams, and open meadows overlooking the Harlem River. Wealthy merchants and officers of the Dutch West India Company built country estates there, far from the noise and the danger of the lower island. When the British took control in 1664, they anglicised its name to Harlem, but for centuries it remained a rural escape for the city's elite, a patchwork of manors and farmland owned by old Dutch families like the Dykmans, the Delanceys, and the Bleekers. During the American Revolution, the Battle of Harlem Heights was fought on its fields, a small but significant victory for George Washington's troops, one that proved the Continental Army could stand its ground. Throughout the 19th century, Harlem evolved from farmland to suburb. The extension of the elevated railways in the 1880s turned it into a commuter district for white middle-class families. Grand brownstones and row houses lined new boulevards, and developers promised a refined alternative to downtown living. By the turn of the century, Harlem was home to Jewish, Irish and Italian families who filled its quiet streets with churches and schools. But speculation outpaced demand. To many, new buildings rose too quickly and landlords found themselves with empty apartments that they simply just couldn't fill. When the subway reached 156th Street in 1904, it suddenly linked Harlem to downtown in minutes and exposed just how overbuilt the neighborhood had become. Property values collapsed almost overnight. Desperate to cover their losses, landlords began renting to black tenants, often at inflated prices. What began as a financial gamble soon turned into a social revolution, because for the first time, middle-class black families, professionals and artists could move into spacious apartments once reserved only for the white elite. And in doing so, they transformed Harlem from a failed real estate venture into the cultural capital of black America. Between 1910 and 1920, the neighborhood became the epicenter for one of the largest internal movements in American history, a movement that would come to be known as the Great Migration. More than 1 million black Americans left the cotton fields of the South, fleeing poverty, lynchings, and Jim Crow. They came by train, by steamship and by wagon, following whispers of northern prosperity. Posters tacked to church doors promised high wages in Chicago, Detroit and New York, and recruiters from northern factories offered free passage and steady work. It was a mass exodus, a quiet rebellion against centuries of oppression. Families packed their lives into battered suitcases and boarded trains at midnight, leaving behind the dust, the debt, and the fear that came with being black in the South. A Mississippi mother might tell her children were going to the promised land, and when the doors of the rail car closed, they were crossing into a new America. In New York, that new America began in Harlem. Peter H. Matthews, now head of the policy racket after Adams's death, recognized that Harlem, with its growing population, crooked police, and distance from the reformers downtown, was fertile ground. He opened his own operations there, planting the seeds of what would become Harlem's most lucrative underground economy. In 1915, reformers and the police raided his offices in one of the largest anti-policy sweeps that New York City had ever seen. Matthews and several of his partners were arrested, posted heavy bail, and served very light sentences. Within a year though, he was dead in his cell on Blackwell's Island, but by then, the game had already taken root in Harlem. Matthews' death left the numbers racket without a king. The old kings of policy were gone, reformers had moved on, but the city's appetite for easy money hadn't gone anywhere. Harlem was swelling with newcomers from the South. It was a neighborhood alive with ambition and risk, and the policy game was waiting for someone to claim it, to bring order and leadership to a neighborhood that was bursting at the seams. And with the end of World War I, Harlem had no shortage of men willing to take their chance. By 1919, America's troops were finally home from the war to end all wars. The air over Manhattan crackled with celebration. On February the 17th, the city turned out for the Harlem Hellfighters' victory parade, a procession unlike anything that New York City had ever seen. Bands played, flags waved, and tens of thousands crowded Fifth Avenue to welcome home their heroes. At the head of the procession marched the 369th Infantry Regiment, Harlem's own, the Harlem Hellfighters, the most decorated and battle-hardened black regiment of the First World War. They had spent 191 consecutive days in the frontline trenches of France, more than any other American unit. When they first shipped out from New York in 1917, they were assigned to the French army, forced to serve under foreign command because white American officers refused to fight beside them. They wore French helmets, carried French rifles, and fought through Champagne and the Argonne Forest, holding their lines through artillery barrages and gas attacks that broke lesser units. The French called them Les Hommes de Bronze, the Men of Bronze, a title earned through courage under relentless fire. The Germans, it was said, called them Hurlenkämpfer, the Hellfighters, for their refusal to retreat. From the battlefields of northern France, the Hellfighters pushed east across the Meuse and into the Rhineland. When they crossed the Rhine into Germany, they became the first Allied unit to reach enemy soil, a symbolic victory that carried more weight than any medal ever could. Their valour was undeniable. For Harlem, these were sons who had proven that courage and discipline were not defined by colour. The Harlem Hellfighters' victory parade that greeted them back home was more than a homecoming, it was vindication. Their boots struck the pavement in perfect rhythm as Lieutenant Jim Europe's all-black military band filled the air with ragtime jazz, the very sound of Harlem itself. Dancer Bill Bojangles Robinson led the column, his baton flashing beneath the pale winter sun. For the crowds watching, it felt like the dawn of a new age, a glimpse of equality finally within reach. Yet when the music faded and the soldiers hung up their uniforms, the Hellfighters discovered that their nation's gratitude was only temporary. The same city that cheered them refused to hire them. The same country that had trusted them with rifles denied them dignity in the streets. Many of these men, battle-tested, disciplined, accustomed to command, returned to a Harlem that was a paradox. On Sundays, church bells echoed down Lenox Avenue as well-dressed families filled the pews. During the week, the very same men in the churches were porters carrying the luggage of men who never fought for their country, cooks and butlers serving in hotels that would never lodge them as guests. And now the pride that had carried them through the trenches of France curdled into bitterness. Even Harlem's educated professionals found themselves barred from the city's offices and banks, institutions that refused to hire black clerks, accountants, or lawyers, no matter how qualified they were. Those who could opened up barbershops, cafes, or newspaper stands. Those who could not rented rooms in overcrowded tenements where 5,000 people might share a single block. But out of the overcrowding came ingenuity. When the rent was due and the money had run out, tenants threw rent parties, clearing the furniture, hiring a pianist, and charging 25 cents at the door. The music that poured from those rooms, ragtime and early jazz, became the soundtrack of survival. The neighbours danced, laughed and drank homemade gin, and the 25 cents they contributed for the privilege of doing so paid to keep a roof overhead. It was poverty dressed in celebration, hardship turned to art. But beneath the laughter, resentment grew. Across America, the end of the war had unleashed a new wave of racial violence. White soldiers returned to find their jobs filled by black migrants, and mobs formed in dozens of cities. The summer of 1919 became known as Red Summer, a season of blood and fire. In Chicago, Washington DC and dozens of smaller towns, black neighborhoods were attacked, homes were burned, and lynchings surged. Veterans like those of the 369th Regiment refused to be terrorized. They fought back, sometimes with the very same weapons that they had carried in France. In Harlem, The news from other cities fueled a hardening resolve. The people who had come north seeking peace found only a different kind of war, one fought in boardrooms, housing offices and on the picket lines. The soldiers who had survived machine gun fire were now surviving poverty. By the end of the decade, Harlem's population swelled beyond capacity. Estimates put more than 250,000 people in a neighbourhood 8 blocks wide and 50 blocks long. Beds were rented by the hour, one worker slept while another laboured. Tenements leaned with the weight of too many lives stacked inside. The smell of coal smoke and cooking oil filled the narrow courtyards, yet amid the squalor, a cultural fire began to burn. Writers, musicians and activists began to speak of a new Negro, a generation that was unashamed of its colour and unwilling to accept inferiority. The foundations of what would be called the Harlem Renaissance was being laid, though few could see it yet. Because Harlem was a pressure cooker, beauty and frustration fused together, each feeding the other. The poems written in cramped apartments, the piano tunes drifting from the rent parties, and the sermons shouted from pulpit to street corner, well, they all carried the same message: we are here and we are worthy. And if by coincidence in 1920 came the spark that would set the decade alight. On January the 20th, the 18th Amendment took effect, launching the national experiment known as Prohibition. The sale, manufacture and transportation of alcohol became illegal overnight. For Harlem, a district sustained by its saloons, taverns and music halls, it was a disaster. Bartenders, waiters and musicians lost their livelihoods. Dozens of clubs shuttered their doors. Respectable work vanished, replaced by whispers of secret underground bars called speakeasies and the bootleg gin that they sold. The government called it a moral victory. For Harlem, it was just another form of punishment. The same men who had fought for liberty abroad were now forbidden to buy a drink in their own neighbourhood. The women who cleaned downtown hotels by day now poured illegal whiskey in back rooms by night. Yet in that chaos, something remarkable happened. Out of necessity, Harlem's nightlife reinvented itself. The music that had once filled public bars now moved underground, into basements, apartments and hidden cellars where the law didn't reach. The sound changed too. Ragtime gave way to jazz, a freer, wilder rhythm that captured both rebellion and release. Musicians played louder, faster and dirtier, their trumpets and saxophones echoing off tin ceilings and cracked plaster walls. Harlem was supposed to go dry. Instead, it came alive. For organised crime, Prohibition was the opportunity of a lifetime. Alcohol was as much a part of American life as baseball or jazz. No law could ever end that appetite. The country still wanted to drink, and someone was going to supply it. Into that vacuum stepped the mob. From coast to coast, a new breed of gangster emerged, ruthless, pragmatic, and organised. They built breweries in warehouses, filled bathtubs with gin, and smuggled whiskey across the Canadian border. Entire criminal industries sprang up overnight. It was called rum running, the illegal transportation of liquor by land or sea. What had once been a local hustle became a billion-dollar black market. Bootlegging turned street thugs into businessmen and racketeers into kings. And in New York, every drop of alcohol ran through the underworld. The Italian mafia, Jewish mob, Irish gangs and corrupt police all fed from the same trough. For the first time, crime in America was truly organised. To them, Harlem represented easy money, a neighbourhood full of nightlife and eager customers, yet starved for legitimate income. As local businesses struggled to survive, the mob saw its chance. They opened speakeasies, took over nightclubs, and used intimidation to muscle their way into ownership. Many black business owners, already pressured by rent and debt, had no choice but to sell. Prohibition had made the mob rich beyond their wildest dreams, and it turned Harlem into a playground for downtown's elite. One of the first casualties of Harlem's new nightlife was Jack Johnson, the former heavyweight champion of the world. After retiring from the ring, Johnson had transformed a dilapidated building at the corner of Lenox Avenue and 142nd Street into a supper club that he had christened the Club Deluxe. The two-story venue had once housed a small theatre downstairs and a dance hall above, but the crowds had once drifted away to newer attractions like the Renaissance Casino on West 133rd Street. In 1922, facing relentless pressure from mob-backed investors and city officials, Johnson was forced to sell. His buyer was Oni the Killer Madden, a powerful Irish mobster from Hell's Kitchen who had deep connections to New York's police. Madden reopened the club a year later under a new name, the Cotton Club, and imposed a rule that said everything about the era: whites only. Inside, the decor was opulent: white tablecloths, chandeliers, murals of cotton fields painted on the walls. The liquor flowed freely, and the stage glittered with black entertainers performing for all white audiences. Duke Ellington's orchestra became the club's soul, his music a blend of sophistication and swagger that defined 1920s Harlem. Stars like Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, Lena Horne and Ethel Waters all took the stage there, but none could sit in the audience when the lights went down. Harlem's gaudiest and best-known night spot, one writer called it, the Cotton Club is a palace of jazz built on humiliation. Soon, other white-owned clubs followed. The cabarets along 133rd Street, the Jungle Alley as it was known, pulsed with music and money. Downtown's social elite, starved for liquor and desperate for danger, poured into Harlem to experience what they called the exotic. They came in limousines and tuxedos, mingling in rooms they would have, well, once condemned. They drank, they danced, they applauded black talent, and then returned home to segregated neighbourhoods. For the mob, it was perfect business. For Harlem, it was another reminder that even its culture could be stolen. And yet, amid that contradiction, the exploitation and creativity, the segregation and the fame, the Harlem Renaissance absolutely exploded. By night, white patrons filled speakeasies and cabarets. By day, Harlem's thinkers and artists built a new cultural identity. The poet Langston Hughes scribbled verses on napkins in cafes, writing of rivers older than time and dreams deferred. Zora Neale Hurston collected the stories and folktales of the South, preserving the voices of a people long silenced. County Cullen and Claude McKay filled journals and newspapers with words that demanded dignity. In saloons and drawing rooms, W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke debated philosophy and art, shaping what Locke famously called the new Negro. Music too became Harlem's heartbeat. From the Cotton Club to Small's Paradise, from rent parties to street corners, jazz carried the neighbourhood's pulse. It was wild, unpredictable, and alive. The perfect sound for a people who refused to be quiet. Harlem streets rang with trumpets and laughter, piano keys and police sirens, sermons and sin. Even the visual arts joined the chorus. Painters like Aaron Douglas turned the rhythms of jazz and the struggle for identity into bold, modernist murals. Photographers such as James Van Der Zee captured the neighbourhood's contradictions, the elegance and the exhaustion, the pride and the poverty, in striking black and white portraits. The Harlem Renaissance was not a single movement but a collision. art, politics and survival converging into one overburdened neighbourhood. The same forces that drove people to crime also drove them to create, and though the profits of Harlem's nightlife flowed downtown into the mob's pockets, the soul of that nightlife belonged entirely to Harlem itself. By the mid-1920s, Harlem had become both a beacon and a battlefield. Uptown, culture was currency. Downtown, crime was business. Jazz and bootleg whiskey filled the same air. The poets and the policymen, the artists and the gangsters, they all breathed the same Harlem night. While white patrons and mobsters grew rich on Harlem's music, its residents watched from the sidewalks, serving drinks and carrying trays for the people who had come to taste their culture. For Harlem's poor, the porters, the waiters, the cleaners, and the dreamers, wealth was always on the other side of the bar. They saw the white elite spend fortune in a single evening and wanted their own piece of that promise. And in a neighbourhood where opportunity was denied, they found their own version of Wall Street, played not with stocks, but with slips of paper, and it was called the numbers. The game offered Harlem's residents a chance, however small, at the same kind of fortune they served to others. A penny bet could return $6. A quarter could change a life. For many, it wasn't just gambling, it was hope disguised as arithmetic. And amid the chaos of Prohibition, one man found a way to turn that hope into an empire. His name was Casper Holstein. Unlike the bootleggers, he didn't need violence, liquor or muscle to get rich. He needed only numbers. Casper Holstein was born in 1876 on the island of St. Croix, then part of the Danish West Indies, to a mother of African descent and a Danish father. When he was 8 years old, his mother brought him to New York, where he grew up in Brooklyn and attended Public School 83 on Green Avenue, one of the few integrated schools in the district. Intelligent and disciplined, he later found steady work as a porter and eventually as a clerk on Wall Street, one of the few black men in Lower Manhattan's financial district. And just like the Harlem Hellfighters, he too served in World War I, joining the Navy before returning home to a city that offered little reward for his loyalty. After the war, Holstein returned to Wall Street as a porter and messenger for a brokerage firm. He was observant, meticulous and fascinated by numbers. Every day he handled clearinghouse totals, stock reports and treasury balances. Somewhere between the ledgers and the ticker tape, inspiration struck. As the story famously goes, Holstein was sitting in a small janitor's closet one afternoon when the idea took shape. He realised that the same logic that governed Wall Street, money moving through patterns, numbers and chance, could be used to create something new. He'd grown up watching small street lotteries in St. Croix, known across the Caribbean as Bito, meaning little ball, where players bet on numbered balls drawn from a sack. Drawing on that memory, Holstein designed his own version for Harlem, a daily lottery rooted in arithmetic rather than luck. He called it Bito. Using his understanding of finance, Holstein built a precise and transparent numbers system that anyone could play. Instead of drawing numbers from a hat, he based his results on the parimutuel betting pools used at New York racetracks, the same system gamblers trusted at Coney Island and Belmont Park. Each day, the totals from the racetrack payouts were published in newspapers, and Holstein used the last 3 digits of those figures to determine the winning number. For a nickel, a player could choose any 3-digit combination between 0 and 999. If their number hit, it was paid out at 600 to 1 odds, which turned 5 cents into $30, the equivalent of around $500 today. For Harlem's working poor, that was a substantial amount of money. It was quite easily rent and groceries for a month. It was simple elegant and powerful, but it was also a dream disguised as mathematics, because the odds told a completely different story. With only one winning number out of 1,000, Holstein and his runners kept nearly 80% of every dollar bet, siphoning off thousands each week. The game fed on hope, and Harlem kept playing, because for the porters, maids and the waiters who served the city's wealthy but never shared in their fortune, that dream was worth every cent. Holstein's operation expanded rapidly. Within a few years, he controlled Harlem's largest policy bank and employed hundreds of runners. His headquarters was the Turf Club, a 5-story building at 111 West 136th Street that he purchased and turned into the heart of his operation. Part office, part social club, and part command centre for the Harlem numbers empire he had built. From there, money flowed in from every corner of the neighbourhood, carried by runners and collectors who reported daily to the Bito King himself. By 1923, Holstein's earnings exceeded $12,000 a day, roughly $220,000 in today's money. He had become a legend in Harlem, known simply as the Bito King. But unlike the bootleg mobsters downtown, Holstein was no parasite. He gave back. He funded dormitories at black colleges, donated to schools in Liberia, supported Harlem's newspapers and paid tuition for poor children. He helped build hurricane relief funds for the Virgin Islands and even founded a small museum. By the mid-1920s, Holstein owned several luxury apartment buildings in Harlem, a Long Island home, and farmland in Virginia. His estimated net worth exceeded $2 million, more than most white businessmen ever made in a lifetime. And that net worth attracted eyes from all over Harlem, attracting new names and new policy bankers. The numbers world became full of characters. After Holstein, Big Joe Eisen ran the second busiest spot at 251 West 125th Street, in the building right beside the Apollo Theatre, clearing as much as $10,000 a day from nickel and dime bets. Further downtown, Henry Miro, a Puerto Rican labourer turned banker, ran his operation out of 157 West 117th Street, while his trusted enforcer, a sharp West Indian named Wilfred Willie Brunder, handled collections before breaking away to start his own bank up at 357 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill, where he catered to the city's black elite who wanted a discreet taste of the numbers. And over on 2247 7th Avenue, Alex Pompez, a respected businessman and baseball executive, managed his own policy empire from his cigar shop. Together, they formed a network that stretched from central Harlem's crowded tenements to the polished brownstones of Sugar Hill, a quiet balance of ambition, profit, and uneasy respect. Harlem's underworld ran on that balance. Everyone knew their corner, their clientele, their percentage. There was no commission, no hierarchy, just mutual understanding. The police got their cut, the players got their chance, and the bankers, well, they got rich. Even white organised crime left it alone. To men like Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano and Oni Madden, Harlem's policy games seemed too small to bother with. A penny racket for the poor, something beneath their notice. They were busy making millions off bootleg beer and Canadian whiskey. Harlem's numbers, to them, were just scraps. But the truth was that Harlem's scraps had become a feast. By the end of the decade, the policy racket was pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars through the neighbourhood every single week. The bankers lived like royalty. They owned fleets of Packards and Cadillacs. They wore diamonds on their fingers and invested quickly into Harlem's new nightclubs and apartment buildings. The newspapers called them policy kings, and for the first time in New York history, a black elite had emerged not from politics, religion or entertainment, but from raw, underground enterprise. It was wealth beyond their wildest dreams, but it came with attention. Because where there was money, there was envy. And Harlem in the late 1920s was full of ambitious men with guns and nothing to lose. The policy bankers were businessmen, not gangsters. They didn't keep gunmen on their payroll or walk around with bodyguards. They needed protection from thieves, rivals, and crooked cops looking to cash in on a raid. For that, they turned to one man, Bob Hulet, Harlem's self-appointed enforcer, a towering figure whose reputation for violence kept the bankers safe and the streets quiet. Bob Hulet was a name that carried weight in Harlem long before the newspapers began writing about him. He'd been born in Manchester, Virginia in 1888 and came north during the Great Migration, settling in Harlem in 1902. Like so many that arrived in those years, he found that opportunity in New York was a myth wrapped in disappointment. The only men making money were the ones willing to take it by force, and Hulet had the size, the nerve, and the instinct for it. By the 1920s, he was one of the most feared gangsters in Upper Manhattan. Bob ran protection rackets up and down Lenox Avenue, extorting speakeasies, brothels, gambling rooms, and small businesses. For a weekly fee, your establishment was safe from the police, from rival hustlers, and most importantly, from Bob himself. It was an old school racket, but he ran it with efficiency and intelligence. The people of Harlem said that Bob didn't have to shout or threaten. He simply walked in, looked around, and made his offer. Everyone in Harlem knew what that offer meant, and as the numbers game grew, Bob saw opportunity. The policy bankers had a vast amount of money pouring in every day, but they had no one to guard it. They were not men of violence, they were accountants with guns that they simply never used. So Bob offered his services to them as a protector, taking a cut in exchange for their safety. It was a simple arrangement that suited both sides. The bankers got security and Bob got wealthy. Within months, every major policy figure in Harlem had Bob Hulet's protection. Men like Joe Eisen, Alex Pompez and Casper Holstein all paid Bubs' tax, and they slept easier because of it. He became Harlem's unofficial insurance policy, the barrier between the city's most lucrative racket and the chaos that surrounded it. For a time, no one dared cross him. Only one man ever tried. In the summer of 1923, Bob heard about a new policy operation running out of the St. Charles building on West 148th Street. It was small, independent, and led by a man named Martin Harris, of whom no photographs have survived. Bob went there personally to offer, or rather demand, his protection. He walked into Harris's office, announced his name, and told him how things worked. Harris nodded politely before telling Bob that he already had protection. Bob laughed and asked who, and Harris pointed outside. Leaning casually against Bob's own car was a teenager, tall, sharp-dressed and completely unfazed by the gangster standing in front of him. Bob stepped outside and said, "Get off my car." The boy leaning against his car smiled and said, "Good, now get off my block." His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, though nobody ever called him that, because everyone knew him by his nickname, Bumpy. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina, on October the 31st, 1905, to Margaret Moultrie and William Johnson. His family were poor but proud, and lived under the same weight that crushed every black family in the Jim Crow South. The fear that one wrong word to the wrong man could cost you your life. When Bumpy was 10 years old, that fear became reality. His older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. There was no trial, no evidence, and no hope for mercy. A lynch mob was forming, and in desperation, Bumpy's parents mortgaged their tiny home to buy Willie's escape, sending him north to live with relatives. It was the kind of wound that never healed, The moment when childhood ended and the world revealed itself as cruel and rigged. As Bumpy grew older, that sense of injustice hardened into defiance. He had a short temper, a sharp tongue, and an instinct to fight back when others stayed quiet. His parents feared for him. He refused to call white men sir, refused to step off the sidewalk for them, refused to hide the anger that seethed beneath his calm exterior. Eventually, to save him from the South, and perhaps to save his life, they sent him north to live with his older sister Mabel in Harlem. But for a teenage boy from Charleston with a chip on his shoulder, Harlem wasn't salvation, it was an education. Bumpy dropped out of high school and took whatever jobs he could find, working for a time as a porter, an errand boy, and even a pool hall cleaner. He was quick-witted, observant, and he learned fast. He noticed how money moved through Harlem, who collected it, who spent it, and who took it at gunpoint. By the time he was 17 in 1923, he'd begun to carve out a piece of the city's underworld for himself. He was handsome, street smart, and always overdressed. He wore silk ties and polished shoes, and he carried both a switchblade and a pistol wherever he went. His pockets were lined with cash from gambling, robberies, and small-time hustles. It was never enough to make him rich, but always enough to make him dangerous, and people liked Bumpy, but they also feared him. He was quick to laugh and quicker to draw, and one of those men who instantly took a liking to him was the man who had just been ordered off his own block, and a man who usually slit the throat of anyone who talked to him like that, Bub Hulet. Bub looked at the 17-year-old for a long moment and then laughed. There was something in Bumpy's eyes that he recognised. It wasn't arrogance, it was fearlessness. In Harlem, that was rarer than money. Bub didn't kill him. Instead, he offered him a job. From that day forward, young Bumpy Johnson became Bub Hulet's right-hand man, his enforcer, and eventually his protege. Together they made an imposing pair. Bub was already a legend, Bumpy was a kid learning fast. They ruled the streets through a mix of diplomacy and fear. If Bub's name didn't settle an argument, then you can bet your bottom dollar that Bumpy's knife did. Within a year, every bookmaker and brothel owner in Harlem knew that crossing them was suicide. Among those who benefited from their arrangement was Alex Pompez, one of the most respected and least violent of the policy bankers. Pompez was a gentleman, quiet, intelligent, and deeply involved in baseball. He owned the Cuban Stars of the Eastern Colored League and later the New York Cubans of the Negro National League. He'd helped organize the first Negro League World Series in 1924 and had a deep passion for scouting Latin American players, bringing men like Martin Diego and Minnie Minioso to the United States long before Major League Baseball would even consider them. Pompez was a visionary, but he wasn't built for street wars. His growing fame in the newspapers made him a target. Petty thieves and extortionists saw him as easy prey, and Bub, who was in charge of his protection, assigned Bumpy as his personal bodyguard. One night in late 1924, a would-be robber tried to hold him up outside his cigar store. Before the man could even cock his pistol, Bumpy Johnson was on him. Fast, silent, and merciless. With the trusty switchblade he always carried in his pocket, Bumpy slashed the man across the face and disarmed him in seconds. Pompez walked away unharmed, and word of the incident spread quickly through Harlem. Bumpy's reputation grew overnight. He was still young, but now his name carried weight. He wasn't just Bub Hulet's boy anymore, he was Bumpy Johnson, the kid who had stood up to Harlem's toughest gangster and then stood beside him. Word of his fearlessness spread from barbershops to back rooms, whispered over card tables and gin bottles. Harlem took notice, and so did one woman who noticed everything. A woman who was about to take control of Harlem's most profitable racket, and her name was Stephanie St. Clair. and to say that Stephanie St. Clair was unlike anyone Harlem had ever seen before was putting it lightly. She was born on the French Caribbean island of Martinique on Christmas Day 1887, the only child of a single mother who worked the cane fields to afford her daughter's schooling. When Stephanie was 12, her mother fell ill and she was forced to leave school to support her. By the time her mother died, she had already learned the first lesson about survival. No one was coming to save her. In 1911, she boarded a ship to Montreal, part of a domestic work program known as the Caribbean Domestic Scheme. She spent 2 years there working as a servant, saving what little she could before moving on to New York in 1912 aboard the SS Guiana. During the 5-day voyage, she taught herself basic English, practicing from a small phrase book in the ship's quarantine ward. She arrived in New York City with nothing but a sharp mind, a French accent, and a will of iron. Stepping off at Ellis Island, the nation's largest immigration gateway in the United States, with nothing but the clothes on her back, St. Clair found herself drawn into New York's underworld out of necessity. And luckily for her, it was a city full of rackets. She fell in with a crew known as the 40 Thieves, one of the city's oldest extortion gangs. So they'd been terrorizing New York since the mid-1800s, and they were mostly Irish and Jewish muscle who controlled rackets like gambling dens, brothels, and a small share of the docks. How a young black woman from Martinique managed to earn a place among them remains a mystery, but she did, and she learned quickly. From the 40 Thieves, St. Clair mastered the quiet art of survival in a man's world, how to read a room, how to threaten without words, and how to turn information into power. Before long, she gravitated towards her own community and made her way uptown to Harlem. Harlem in those years was still forming, its streets alive with soldiers, porters and dreamers from every corner of the black diaspora. St. Clair quickly learned to navigate it. For a time, she was in a relationship with a small-time hustler named Duke, who tried to force her into prostitution. When Duke was killed in a gang dispute, she fell in love with another man, who we only know as Ed, but who is pictured with her here, and together they began selling small amounts of narcotics on the side streets of Harlem. Within months, she had made $30,000, but when she told Ed she planned to strike out on her own, he attacked her. She fought back, shoving him so hard that he cracked his skull against a table and died. That was the moment that Madame St. Clair was born. In 1923, St. Clair took $10,000 of the $30,000 she made with Ed, a fortune for any black woman of that time, and opened up her own policy bank. Within 12 months, business was booming. Out of her Harlem stronghold at 117 West 141st Street, she ran her numbers empire like a military operation. Tight, precise, and unbelievably disciplined. Her runners wore clean suits, used code words, and followed strict schedules. Anyone who skimmed, she cut. Anyone who stole, she killed. Harlem had seen plenty of policy bankers before, but never one like her. Within a year, she had more than 40 collectors working her lines, 10 comptrollers keeping her ledgers, and a reputation that reached every block from 7th Avenue to the river. Her profits topped $500,000 a year, and she quickly overtook Casper Holstein as the biggest policy banker in Harlem. To Harlem, she became Madame St. Clair. Downtown, they called her the Queen of Policy. She was tall, impeccably dressed, and spoke with a French accent and the cutting precision of a Parisian professor, earning her another nickname, the Tiger from Marseilles. She wore tailored suits, extravagant hats, and carried herself like royalty. But beneath the elegance was steel. Queenie had a temper that could stop a room cold and a vocabulary sharp enough to wound. She was fearless, brilliant, and utterly unwilling to bow to any man. black or white. After hearing of Bumpy's defence of Alex Pompez, her ranks and standings was bolstered even more. St. Clair thought she could use someone like that around her, and she employed Bumpy as her main enforcer and bodyguard, offering him a hefty salary that Bub could never match. By day, Bumpy kept her operation in line, and by night, he escorted her to plays and concerts across Harlem and downtown Manhattan. So their partnership was strange from the start. Some people said they were lovers, others said it was strictly business. Either way, they understood each other. St. Clair was strategic, cultured and commanding. Bumpy was raw, fearless and physical. Together they became one of Harlem's most formidable alliances, and with Bumpy by her side, she was no longer just a policy banker, she was quite literally Harlem's queenpin. Newspapers began combining both her names and calling her Madam Queen of Policy, which stuck. To Harlem's poor, she was a folk hero, a woman who defied gangsters, outsmarted corrupt cops, and built a fortune from nothing. But St. Clair was more than a criminal. She saw herself as a voice for Harlem's independence. As the numbers game began attracting attention, she published open letters in the Amsterdam News, warning Harlem not to be exploited by downtown racketeers. Her language was fiery but elegant, part manifesto, part sermon, denouncing police brutality, political corruption, and the hypocrisy of the city's so-called moral crusaders. She told her runners to carry themselves with dignity, to treat their work with the same precision as a banker or a lawyer. To her, running numbers wasn't just crime, it was enterprise. And like Casper Holstein, every dollar she earned found its way back into Harlem. Bail funds for men wrongfully arrested, scholarships for neighbourhood children, and quiet envelopes for families who couldn't pay their rent. The policy racket had become Harlem's underground economy, a self-sustaining network that paid bills, bought homes, and in its own way, provided stability where the city offered none. And at its centre stood a black woman with a French accent and a pearl-handled pistol in her purse, a mind for mathematics and a tongue sharp enough to cut through the lies of politicians and police alike. By the end of the decade, she had traded the cramped back rooms of Lenox Avenue for one of Harlem's most prestigious addresses, 409 Edgecombe Avenue. The building stood 13 stories tall, perched just south of 155th Street in Sugar Hill. Built in the neo-Georgian style with its brick facade, limestone trim, and a marbled floor lobby that glowed under brass chandeliers, 409 Edgecombe wasn't merely a residence, it was a statement. It was Harlem's own Park Avenue, home to the creme de la creme of the Harlem Renaissance, its thinkers, its leaders, its self-made elite. It was known as Harlem's House of Celebrities, and it embodied the height of black excellence in 1920s New York City. Within its walls lived W.E.B. Du Bois and his wife Shirley, painter Aaron Douglas, literary critic William Stanley Braithwaite, sculptor Elizabeth Catlett, journalist Marvel Cook, and a young lawyer named Thurgood Marshall who would one day sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. The building hummed with intellect and ambition, the quiet confidence of a generation that refused to accept the limits imposed on them. St. Clair fit perfectly among them, though her wealth came from a different kind of empire. Her apartment on the 4th floor was decorated with velvet drapes, heavy mahogany furniture, and a glass-top table inlaid with gold coins, a small, deliberate reminder of where her fortune had come from. Visitors described the place as a mix of French elegance and Harlem defiance. There were crystal decanters on sideboards, framed French prints on the walls, and always, somewhere nearby, a bodyguard in a tailored suit. Stephanie St. Clair didn't need to shout to command a room, her presence did the work. The people who visited knew exactly where they stood, beneath her, and in her debt. Despite her main enforcer Bumpy getting sent to Sing Sing in 1928 on a grand larceny charge, Stephanie maintained her empire with an iron fist, with Bub Hulet taking over the protection whilst Bumpy was away. And by 1929, policy gambling had reached an industrial scale. 30 banks operated across the neighbourhood, some spanning 20 city blocks. More than 800 runners carried bets every day, every single one protected by Bub Hulet and his gang. On any given morning, a Harlem resident could walk into a barbershop, a drugstore, or a candy stand and quietly hand over a nickel to play their numbers. The odds were long, the payouts high, and the money constant. But success in Harlem never stayed quiet for long. The city's white crime bosses were watching. Prohibition had made them millionaires, but as the decade neared its end, the liquor business was becoming riskier. The mob's eyes turned north towards Harlem, where cash changed hands on every corner and not a drop of whiskey was required. The peace that Madame St. Clair and her fellow bankers had maintained for years was fragile, and she knew it. She'd built an empire through intellect, charm and sheer will, but now the underworld's balance of power was shifting. The beer baron of the Bronx, Dutch Schultz, well, he was rising fast and he wasn't content to rule just his own territory. He wanted Harlem, he wanted the numbers, and he didn't care who he had to kill to get them. The Queen of Harlem had reigned uncontested, but her throne was about to be challenged by the most violent man in New York City. By the end of the Roaring Twenties, Harlem's policy bankers had grown so wealthy that even the city's corruption couldn't keep them hidden anymore. For years, the police had treated the numbers rackets as harmless, an indulgent little vice confined to candy stores and barbershops, played mostly by working people with no real power. But now, it was impossible to ignore. Arrests began to climb, and reporters started to take notice. But the raids were never about law and order, they were about leverage. New York's justice system was an open marketplace where everyone, from the patrolman on the beat to the district attorney, could be bought. The city ran on graft, an endless exchange of favours and envelopes that kept the entire machine humming. Harlem's club owners, gamblers, pimps and policy bankers all paid their fair share of protection money, but as their profits swelled, so did the appetite of those collecting. Police captains began feeding reports of Harlem's growing wealth to their superiors, who in turn passed them on to men even higher up the ladder, politicians who had ties to Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that had controlled New York for decades. Those politicians in turn had their own friends in the underworld, and once Harlem's numbers racket reached Tammany's ears, it was only a matter of time before the city's most dangerous men came calling, and that wasn't always the mobsters. Corrupt police chiefs demanded weekly payments or threatened arrests and convictions. These elite policy bankers now knew that they needed a protection of a different kind. Something stronger than the guns of Bub Hulet and more reliable than the handshakes of corrupt cops. They needed a lawyer. Someone who could move through the corridors of the courthouse as easily as they moved through the alleys of Harlem. Someone who understood the game, knew the law, and wasn't afraid to twist both when necessary. They found him in a young attorney named Dixie Davis. Dixie was born Richard Davidowitz in 1905, the son of a Jewish tailor who'd moved the family from the Lower East Side to the Catskills in search of a quieter life. He was bright, charming, and ambitious, with the kind of natural charisma that made juries lean forward when he spoke. After graduating from Syracuse University Law School and passing the New York bar, He opened his own practice in Manhattan and quickly built a reputation for defending gamblers, bootleggers and small-time racketeers. His talent wasn't in manipulating the law, it was in understanding people. Dixie could read a room like a poker hand. He knew which judge drank, which clerk needed money, and which cop had a sick child at home. By 1930, every major policy banker in Harlem had him on retainer. He was smooth, well-dressed and discreet, exactly the kind of man the underworld needed when things went wrong. By 1931, after years of defending them, Dixie started to realise that there was far more money to be made not in defending the criminals, but by joining them. The city was changing. The Great Depression was dragging banks and businesses to their knees. The 18th Amendment, the law that had made Prohibition possible, was cracking. It had made men rich beyond imagination, but it was also collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. People were drinking openly again, enforcement was a joke, and the federal government was tired of pretending otherwise. And in that moment, Dixie Davis saw an opportunity that would change everything. Amongst his many clients, one man stood out. It was a client whose name carried weight in every saloon, every back room, and every police precinct in the Bronx. His name was Arthur Flegenheimer, although everyone else knew him as Dutch Schultz. Arthur had been born in the Bronx in 1901. The son of German Jewish immigrants. His father abandoned the family when he was still a child, a wound that never quite healed. He left school early, working whatever jobs he could find, printing press assistant, truck loader, delivery boy, before drifting into the world of speakeasies and protection rackets that were growing like weeds in the outer boroughs. In his early 20s, he found himself working as a bouncer at the Hub Social Club located at 543 Brook Avenue, a seedy little drinking spot in the Bronx ran by a gangster named Joey Noy, of whom no photographs have survived. Arthur had a reputation for violence that bordered on the sadistic, one which earned him the nickname of Dutch Schultz, which was taken from another ruthless gangster in the Bronx from the 1800s, and Noy saw in him a perfect partner. Together, they opened up a string of speakeasies, cutting out the middlemen and smuggling their own beer from New Jersey breweries. Schultz often rode shotgun on the trucks, shotgun literally in hand, ready to fend off any potential hijackers. The pair built their empire on intimidation. When rival bootleggers refused to buy their beer, they didn't negotiate. They kidnapped Joe Rock, one of the Bronx's toughest operators and a man who no photographs have survived of. They beat him half to death and hung him by his thumbs from a meat hook. They even bandaged his eyes with a cloth infected with chlamydia, a deliberate act of torture that left him permanently blind. After that, no one dared stand in their way. Within a few years, Schultz and Noy controlled every speakeasy in the Bronx and parts of Upper Manhattan. When Noy was gunned down by rival gunmen, Schultz inherited the entire empire. The newspapers called him the beer baron of the Bronx. By 1931, Dutch Schultz was one of the richest gangsters in New York. His breweries pumped out millions of gallons of beer a year, his trucks ran day and night, and his lieutenants collected envelopes from every saloon between the Harlem River and the Grand Concourse. He'd fought and killed to protect his territory, the most notable of adversaries being Legs Diamond, a man who tried to muscle in on his territory and who ended up dead. Schultz ruled through fear, and it worked. But then, it all ended. The 18th Amendment was repealed, and Prohibition, the law that had made him a king, was over. In the Bronx, the breweries that had once made Dutch Schultz a millionaire now sat silent, their trucks idle, their taps dry. Dutch had money, muscle, and men who needed work, but no product left to move. For the first time in years, the Dutchman was restless. He was a violent man, but not a stupid one. He knew he needed a new revenue stream, something steady, untaxed, and immune to repeal. It was then that his lawyer, Dixie Davis, came to him with an idea. He explained it to Schultz plainly. The policy bankers aren't mobsters, Dixie said. They're gamblers, men running an illegal business on a peaceful, non-violent basis. In other words, Arthur, they're suckers. Davies laid out the logic. Schultz already controlled the Bronx, every saloon, every brewery, every politician from the Harlem River to the Grand Concourse was in Schultz's pocket, and the Bronx shared its southern border with Harlem, where the numbers game thrived. The two worlds were separated by little more than a bridge, but economically, they were galaxies apart. Harlem bankers had money, but no protection. Schultz had protection, but no product, and together they could build something that would dwarf anything that Prohibition had ever offered. Davis described the racket with the precision of a man who had studied it line by line. The numbers game was elegant, he said, profitable, self-sustaining, and entirely cash-based. No overhead, no inventory, and no ledgers that the police could trace. The players were loyal, the profits were constant, and the odds ensured that the house always won. Schultz didn't need much convincing. He'd built his empire on beer, but he understood business. The numbers racket was perfect. It required no breweries, no smuggling routes, and no dependence on politicians who could turn on him with the stroke of a pen. It was invisible, renewable, and infinitely scalable. He sat back, cigarette in hand, and imagined Harlem streets, the candy stores, barbershops, and the pool halls where coins and slips changed hands all day long. Every nickel, every dime, every dream wagered on those cramped back rooms was money waiting to be collected. The Bronx had made him rich. Harlem, he realised, could make him immortal. The peace that had protected the numbers racket for nearly a decade was about to end. The beer baron of the Bronx was coming north, and Harlem's gamblers were about to learn what violence really looked like. Dutch first approached Bob Hulet, the man that every policy banker turned to when trouble came knocking. Hulet had ruled those streets for years, collecting protection money from clubs, brothels and gambling dens with a mixture of charm and quiet brutality. He was Harlem's unofficial police department, and Dutch knew that if he wanted the numbers, he needed Bub. The meeting was quick and businesslike. Dutch offered him $200 a week to act as his go-between, a small fortune in the middle of the Great Depression. Hulet accepted. He understood what refusal meant. And with Harlem's own muscle now on his payroll, Dutch Schultz was free to move in. The first banker to fall was Big Joe Ison, a 27-year-old West Indian who had once worked as an elevator operator and a shipyard labourer. Ambitious, steady and smart with figures, Ison entered the numbers racket in 1920 as a collector. 3 years later, he was one of Harlem's biggest bankers with runners on every corner and thousands of players across the district. Dutch picked him as the perfect target. One cold afternoon, Joe Ison was standing on a Harlem Street corner when a dark sedan rolled to a stop beside him. A heavy-set white man stepped out, flashing a badge. "We're cops," he said. "Get in the car." That man was Bo Weinberg, Schultz's top enforcer, a professional killer, and a man whose name alone made other men flinch. Behind the wheel was Abe Landau, another of Dutch Schultz's feared triggermen. Ison climbed in, knowing better than to argue. As they drove slowly up St. Nicholas Avenue, Bo pressed his revolver against Joe Ison's ribs. "We're a couple of the boys," he said, "and you're gonna give us a cut of your business. We'll be in touch." When they finally dropped him back in Harlem, he was trembling. He didn't wait to think. He went straight to his lawyer, Dixie Davis, whose offices now filled the entire 39th floor of 1450 Broadway. Dixie didn't need an explanation. Dutch Schultz, he said simply, is bringing his organisational talent to Harlem, and if you're smart, Joe, you'll listen to what I tell you. He introduced Joe to George Weinberg, Beau's younger brother, softer spoken, polite, but every bit as dangerous. George explained that he could provide protection from the very men threatening him for $600 a week. Eisen hesitated. Bub Hulet already protects us, he said, and at that moment, from an adjoining door, another office opened. Bub Hulet stepped inside. "These are my guys, Joe," he said calmly, "and it's best to pay up." That was the end of the conversation. The Weinbergs and Abe Landau were the deadliest men in Dutch's crew, silent, efficient, and loyal to Dutch to the point of fanaticism. Big Joe Eisen didn't need to be told twice. Within days, his once independent bank had become the pilot operation for Dutch Schultz's newest business venture. The beer baron of the Bronx was now collecting on numbers. After Big Joe came Henry Miro, a stubborn Puerto Rican banker who had no interest in bowing to outsiders. Like Eisen, Miro had built his operation from scratch. A tight, disciplined network running out of 128 West 117th Street. When the Weinbergs approached him, he pushed back, refusing to pay protection to anyone apart from Bub. So they changed tactics. Instead of summoning him to Dixie Davis's office, they brought him to Davis's apartment, a private meeting at 19 East 98th Street, where Dutch Schultz himself was waiting. Dixie would later recall the night and the first time that he saw Dutch conduct business vividly. "Up until then, I'd always expected a ruffian," he said, "but he was not that way at all. He was small, well set, with good features. The girls used to say he looked like Bing Crosby with his nose bashed in. That night, he was polite, well spoken, even amiable. There was something off about him though. He wore expensive silk shirts and $10 neckties, gifts from hangers-on, but his suit was a cheap $35 ready-made that didn't match. There was also a huge bulge at his waistline where he had his pistol under his vest." This night, Henry Miro came quickly to the point. He protested about the protection, percentages and one thing or another. The Dutchman spoke quietly and asked Henry and George Weinberg into my kitchen. They were only gone a minute or two and then Miro came back into the lounge and said, "Great Dixie, when do we get started?" Dixie Davis would later reveal what really happened in that kitchen, a story that he said had been told to him 2 years later by George Weinberg, one of Dutch Schultz's most trusted lieutenants and brother of Beau. It had been simple, brutal, and unmistakably Dutch. "Henry," the Dutchman said, levelling his cold stare across the table, "you do what I say, or I'll kill you." Henry Miro, terrified, tried to steady his voice. "Why, Arthur," he said, using Schultz's birth name, "you know I always do what you say." That was enough. Miro wasn't a gangster. Like the other Harlem policy men, he was a gambler, not a killer. Dutch's reputation alone was enough to make hardened men tremble, and Miro folded without resistance. Within days, Schultz was collecting protection payment from both Miro and Joe Eisen, two of the largest policy banks in Harlem. But for Schultz, that wasn't enough. He never wanted a piece, he wanted it all. And as luck or fate would have it, the perfect opportunity was about to present itself. It came on Thanksgiving Eve, 1931, a night Harlem's policy bankers would remember as the worst holiday of their lives. That evening, the winning number was 527. To most New Yorkers, it meant nothing, but in Harlem, it meant everything. The first two digits add up to number 7, giving you a pair of lucky double sevens, Harlem's most superstitious number. In the numbers game, players often followed patterns and beliefs passed down through the dream books, little pamphlets that runners handed out that matched numbers with symbols, events and omens that was designed to increase the amount of bets a punter would make. The number 7 had long been considered the luckiest of all, tied to religion, fortune and fate. In November, the 11th month, many bettors doubled down on it, believing that the month of thanks, as November was known, would bring divine favour. When 527 hit, it wasn't just a win, it was a clean sweep. Thousands had played it. Joe Ison's policy operation was wiped out in a single draw, paying out every cent wagered that day and $18,000 more. It was a catastrophe. When the dust settled, Ison turned to the one man he thought might be able to save him, his lawyer, Dixie Davis. Dixie, who now moved between Harlem's gamblers and the Bronx killers with the ease of a diplomat, told him there was only one person in New York City with that kind of cash and the will to help, and his name was Dutch Schultz. So just like with Miro, they met in Dixie Davis's apartment. Schultz sat at the kitchen table, his hat still on, a pistol laid carefully beside his hand. Ison pleaded his case, explaining the loss, the bad luck, the impossible odds. Dutch listened, unmoved, until finally he spoke. He said, "I'll lend you the 18 grand, but I'm taking 70% of your business." Ison froze. 70? You can't. Dutch picked up his gun, cocked it, and placed it back down on the table. The click echoed in the silence and Ison said nothing more. And just like that, the Bronx beer baron had taken control of Harlem's third largest policy bank, and he wasn't going to stop there. That night, Schultz poured himself a drink and confided in Dixie. He told him flatly, "I'm going to take control of all the bankers in Harlem, Dixie, just as soon as I get this Mick off my back." The Mick he was referring to was Vincent Coll, a former member of Schultz's crew who had broken away to start his own gang, igniting one of the bloodiest wars of Prohibition, the Bronx Beer War. For nearly 2 years, the Bronx had been soaked in blood. The war between Schultz and Coll had claimed more than 40 lives, with each side losing around 20 men. Schultz, who had built his fortune on discipline and fear, now found himself unravelling. The constant ambushes, bombings and assassinations drove him to near madness. At one point, Schultz walked into the 42nd Precinct, a police station inside his own territory, and publicly offered a house in Westchester County to any officer who killed Vincent Coll. It was an extraordinary moment, a gangster openly hiring the police to do his killing for him, but this was 1931, and in New York, anything could be bought. Then came the moment that made Coll infamous. On July the 28th, 1931, he and his men launched a drive-by shooting on East 107th Street, targeting Joey Rayo, one of Schultz's top enforcers. Rayo escaped unhurt, but Coll's men missed their mark and their bullets tore into a crowd of children playing outside a candy store. 5-year-old Michael Vengali was killed, and 5 other children were wounded. The city reeled. Newspapers ran photographs of Michael's mother grieving at his funeral. Radio commentators called for Coll's execution. Jimmy Walker gave him a new name that would follow him for the rest of his life, Mad Dog Coll. Coll went into hiding for 6 months but somehow beat the case. There were no willing witnesses, and the police corruption that protected Schultz now extended to his enemies. When he emerged, he was even more unpredictable. He accepted a $25,000 contract to kill none other than Lucky Luciano, bringing both Luciano and Schultz together in rare agreement. Schultz matched the bounty, and now there was $50,000 on Mad Dog Coll's head. The contract went to Oni Madden, the Irish mobster who owned the Cotton Club, one of Harlem's crown jewels. Madden had long ties to Col, having mentored him in their Gopher Gang days, and he lured the Mad Dog into a trap. Just after midnight on February the 8th, 1932, Vincent Col left his apartment at the Cornish Arms Hotel on West 23rd Street in Manhattan and walked into the London Chemist drugstore across the street to use the telephone. He was on the line with Oni Madden, pleading for a truce with Schultz after half of his crew and his brother had been wiped out by Dutch, who traced the call. Vincent Col never saw the gunmen enter. 15 bullets tore through the booth, cutting him down where he stood. When the police arrived, Col was dead on the floor, the receiver still dangling from the cord. He was 23 years old. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Dutch Schultz slept soundly. The Mick was gone, the Bronx was his again, and now he could finally focus his full attention on Harlem's numbers racket. Dutch was no stranger to blood, and if Harlem wouldn't give him what he wanted peacefully, he would take it by force. But Harlem's bankers were already bleeding. When 527 was drawn the previous November, they'd come to remember that day as Black Wednesday, the night the entire numbers underworld nearly went broke. One of the hardest hits was Alex Pompez, a quiet but shrewd operator whose clientele stretched from barbers to ball players. When the totals were tallied, Pompez discovered he'd lost $68,000, around $1.5 million today, wiped off a single balance sheet in a single night. He recovered easily, but the visibility of that recovery painted a target on his back. A few weeks after Mad Dog Col's death, two of Dutch Schultz's lieutenants, Lulu Rosenkrantz and Larry Carney, came to Pompez's cigar shop with the veneer of diplomacy. Their pitch was businesslike. They offered protection, demanded $600 a week, and explained that this was the same agreement that Joe Eisen had already taken. But Pompez refused. He wasn't a street thug. He was a businessman who had earned his place, and he thought he could stand on principle, and so he sent them away. 2 days later, Dutch Schultz himself walked into that cigar shop on 7th Avenue, and in his soft, measured voice, he asked the question that silenced the room. "What's the matter, Alex? You don't want to come in with me? You think you're going to find a man with horns on his head? I'm not the devil, you know." The shop went quiet and Pompez tried to laugh it off, but he soon realised that Dutch Schultz was not a man to be laughed at. He drew out a 4.5, set it on the counter, barrel inches from Pompez's temple, and said to him, "You're going to be the first guy I make an example of in Harlem, Alex." And by the time that Dutch Schultz picked up his gun from the counter, Alex Pompez had been reduced to a minority holder in his own policy bank, now owning just 30%, with Schultz walking away with 70%. If Pompez's humiliation announced Dutch's intention, Casper Holstein's surrender confirmed the pattern. From the Turf Club, he had watched the calendar of defeats accumulate, and he knew what happened to those who resisted. When Lulu and Bo paid him a visit, Holstein did the arithmetic and cut a deal. 70% to Schultz, 30% to him to keep the lights on and his runners alive. He accepted, pragmatically, without a scene. With those capitulations, Dutch shifted from threat to structure. Using inside knowledge supplied by Henry Miro, a man Schultz relied on for the technical map of Harlem's numbers economy, he began buying into smaller banks, nudging out independent operators and converting grudging compliance into control. He called the patchwork of banks he now controlled the Combination, a bland label for what was by any other measure a hostile takeover. Bob Hulet supplied local enforcement when needed, the Bronx gunmen supplied the muscle. Together they kept the bankers in line, loans were offered with a pistol on the table, interest was collected with a boot at the door. But the combination was not total, because not everyone folded. A handful of bankers chose the other path, resistance. And one of those was the Madam Queen of Policy. St. Clair had watched the Bronx beer wars burn neighbourhoods into ash. She had watched children and shop fronts pay the price for downtown men's quarrels. She would not stand by while the same mechanics of intimidation turned Harlem into another killing ground. So in May 1932, she did what power rarely expects. She walked into a courtroom and demanded legal protection. She asked a magistrate for a bench warrant for Arthur Flegenheimer and the men who had come to enforce his will in Harlem. She spoke with the clipped, dangerous grace of someone who had been forged in fire. "It's Schultz's life or mine," she told the bench. "Dutch knows I'm the only one in Harlem who can fend him off, and I will. But one of us is going to die." The court dismissed her. The magistrate, wary and complicit in a city where precincts and pockets were bought and where Tammany knots ran deep, waved her away. The legal system had failed her. The city had shown its hand. That dismissal changed everything. The combination existed because behind it stood men who controlled precincts, judges and votes, and it was enforced by men who did not blink when the order came down. In the weeks that followed, the majority of Harlem's bankers sold their shares and lived, but a small, angrier circle dug in its heels. For St. Clair, the choice was now clear: take a cut and survive, or resist and risk everything. She chose the latter, and that was probably because her main enforcer, the man who would become known as the Godfather of Harlem and the only hoodlum who could actually keep Dutch Schultz away from the numbers, was about to be released from jail in April 1932. Bumpy was now 25 years old and, after a stint at Sing Sing, already something of a legend. As Harlem teetered on the edge of all-out war, both sides were desperate for him to join their ranks. Madame St. Clair wanted him to defend her banks. Bub Hulet, now working under Dutch, wanted him to join their crew. Even Dutch himself sent out feelers, hoping to bring him in as a trusted lieutenant. Bumpy refused him. He had seen what Bubs' men were doing to their own people and had no interest in becoming another strong arm for an outsider. Dutch, for all his talk of loyalty and business, was still a man from the Bronx, a man who saw Harlem as something to be conquered. He wasn't the crude, racist caricature later shown in film. In truth, Schultz's mob was one of the most ethnically mixed in New York. But in Bumpy's mind, he had no right in Harlem. Someone who did was his old boss, Madame St. Clair. Bumpy came back and pledged himself to St. Clair, but when he did, it was as though a spark had touched dry timber. The Queen gave him a simple order: run Dutch Schultz out of Harlem. And quietly, behind closed doors, the policy bankers who'd been forced to sign over shares of their businesses began contributing to Bumpy's war fund. Their money, collected by trusted runners and passed through candy stores and pool halls, financed the weapons, the cars, and the men who would soon turn Harlem's streets into battlefields. The first major clash came that summer when Bumpy and Bub finally confronted each other. No one remembers quite how it started, an argument, maybe a territory dispute or a double cross, but it ended in a hail of gunfire that left both men hospitalised. From that moment on, the city understood that a new kind of war had begun. Over the following months, more than 40 men were killed in the fighting. Most of the dead were Schultz's, easily recognisable as outsiders, pale-faced gunmen in tailored suits who couldn't walk a Harlem block without drawing eyes. They were ambushed in hallways, dragged from taxis, and shot through car windows. Sometimes they were even found floating in the Harlem River. Policy bankers disappeared without a trace, their offices abandoned, telephones ringing unanswered. Harlem had turned inward on itself. The nights were filled with sirens and the sharp echo of gunfire bouncing off brownstones. For a time, the violence seemed endless, but in late 1933, it was abruptly stopped. Bub Hulet, Schultz's most trusted Harlem lieutenant, was arrested on grand larceny and convicted. The charge was minor compared to the crimes that he had committed, but the sentence, 5 years in prison, was enough to cripple Schultz's operations uptown. Without Bub's local influence, the Dutchman soldiers were blind in unfamiliar streets, and within weeks, most of them had fled back to the Bronx. St. Clair and Bumpy had done what no one thought possible. They had fended off Dutch Schultz, but peace in Harlem was always fragile, and Dutch wasn't finished testing it just yet. In late 1934, he imported a new enforcer from Chicago named Ulysses Rollins, a black gunman who swaggered through Harlem announcing himself as Dutch's new muscle and boasting that he was there to take Bumpy Johnson down. It was a reckless move, a provocation as obvious as it was dangerous, and everyone knew it would end in blood. In June 1934, Bumpy was sitting in a restaurant on the corner of 7th Avenue and 126th Street when Rollins walked in. Witnesses said the two men locked eyes, and within seconds Bumpy's switchblade flashed. He slashed Rollins 36 times before he could draw his own gun. The floor was slick with blood and Rollins was left for dead. Doctors removed one of Rollins's eyes, patched him up and assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. That same night, half blind and covered in bandages, Rollins slipped out of the hospital and went hunting for Bumpy. He found him at the Alhambra Grill, the grand restaurant in this building that still stands today on 7th Avenue. Rollins burst through the door, raised his gun and fired. The bullet tore through Bumpy's hat and missed his skull by an inch, but it struck another woman behind the counter. Her name was Madeline Glass. She was a waitress who had worked at the Alhambra for years, and she died instantly. An off-duty police officer eating dinner nearby wrestled Rollins to the ground before he could fire again. He was arrested on the spot, and the mugshot taken that night still survives. A grainy photograph of a gaunt man with one eye, his face scrawled over with the pen of a police clerk. The shooting of Madeline Glass shocked Harlem. For months the community had endured shootings, stabbings and disappearances, but this was different. This was an innocent woman killed in a feud that she had nothing to do with, and it was the moment that the neighbourhood realised that enough blood had been spilled. By the summer of 1934, the Harlem numbers war had burned itself out. Bub Hulet was gone, Ulysses was gone. Dutch's men couldn't navigate Harlem without someone on the inside and had vanished from the avenues, so Stephanie St. Clair decided to stop guarding the fort and to go on the offensive. She understood that violence alone would not save Harlem's numbers. What was needed was leverage of a different kind, the kind that would force the institutions that had looked the other way to act. So she spent the early summer of 1932 calling in favours, tracing paper trails, and assembling the one thing Dutch could not buy outright, keeping the reliable information about where his operation really lived under wraps. Using trusted runners, barbers, shopkeepers and a handful of policemen who still kept their oaths, she discovered the location of one of Schultz's central clearinghouses and fed that intelligence to the few honest officers who remained in the precincts. What followed was surgical. 5 plainclothes officers slipped through the window of a 6-room apartment on the top floor of 550 West 146th Street, a cramped space that for months had been the quiet nerve centre of an enormous flow of cash. More police waited in the streets below. They opened canvas bags, paper wrappers and unopened boxes to find what St. Clair had promised. A mountain of policy slips, hundreds of thousands of little bets that, when added up, accounted for millions in wagers. 6 tin boxes held the petty cash, $2,164 in small bits, and 14 of Schultz's workers were taken into custody that night. The haul and the arrests were sufficiently serious that the clearinghouse had to be moved outside city limits. For a time, the Dutchman was literally forced out of Harlem. Dutch's operation was disrupted, and his men were alarmed. St. Clair did not stop at that raid. While Bumpy Johnson and her lieutenant kept pressure on the streets, she took the fight into the storefronts that had become Dutch's arteries, attacking the businesses that had facilitated his betting network and publicly naming the men who carried his money, quietly tipping off a few honest detectives to where else to look. In the short term, it worked. Arrests mounted, ledgers were seized, and the cost of doing business under Schultz rose. For once, the machinery of law enforcement had been turned, if only partly, against the intruder. But she had also stepped into a fight for which Schultz was, by temperament and habit, better prepared. He knew how to wage an all-out gang war in a way St. Clair had never chosen to do so. Where she had spent years making alliances and quietly building power, Schultz had spent years making enemies and learning to unmake them with violence. He responded by ratcheting up pressure, beatings, kidnappings, selective murders of policy bankers who resisted, and a campaign of intimidation designed to frighten St. Clair's supporters out of the field. There was a practical cruelty to his strategy, terror that targeted the small men who kept the banks running, because without clerks and runners, the operation withers. Schultz also put $50,000 on St. Clair's head, the same price as was on Mad Dog Cole's, and that kind of money in the middle of a Great Depression attracted hitmen from all over the country. One day, Bumpy Johnson had to hide St. Clair in a bin under Cole when he heard that 6 out-of-town hitmen from Chicago had come to Harlem to kill the Queen of Policy. After that event, St. Clair, who had always insisted that her work was as much social as it was profiteering, made painful calculations. Life in the streets had a value she would not see squandered for the sake of pride alone. Under the Dutchman's pressure, she withdrew from some fronts, focused on defending her key people, and pushed a different battle through the press. The Amsterdam News, long a voice in Harlem, became a microphone for her grievances, and she used it to frame the war not as mere criminal rivalry, but as a defense of a black institution in a black neighborhood. So at this point, neither side had won the war. There was just a very uneasy ceasefire. At a sit-down, St. Clair allowed Dutch back into Harlem, where he reclaimed what he had before the war, and Dutch took the bounty off her head, the two dividing up the numbers profits. For St. Clair, she had peace because Bumpy warned her that this guy would not stop until she was dead. Plus, Dutch had more money and thus all the police in his pockets, but the reason for Dutch Schultz uncharacteristically agreeing to stop the violence is because he found a way to fix the numbers game like never before. In late autumn 1934, as Dutch was steadying the numbers ship and Harlem maintained a sense of peace, a short, bespectacled man named Otto Abadabba Berman approached Schultz. Berman had grown up in New York, the son of Jewish immigrants, and had earned a quiet reputation as one of the most brilliant mathematical minds in the city. He could glance at a string of figures and solve complex equations in seconds. No paper, no pencil, just raw calculation. It earned him the nickname Abadabba, a nonsense word for something almost supernatural. Abadabba was also credited with coining the phrase, "It's nothing personal, it's just business." He had once been a respectable accountant, but by 1933 everybody in the city, including him, knew who Dutch Schultz was and what he controlled. The policy racket had become the largest untaxed business in New York, so Berman approached the Dutchman with a proposition worth listening to. For $10,000 a week, he claimed, he could guarantee that Schultz's policy banks would almost never lose money again. At first, Schultz laughed him off, then Abba Dabba explained the math. Every afternoon, he would station himself at the racetrack with a telephone line ready. Just before the 7th race, he would call Bo Weinberg, Schultz's trusted lieutenant and the man who was responsible for counting the day's mountain of policy slips, back in the Bronx. From that day's payouts, Berman would relay the first 2 digits and then Weinberg would quickly sort through the slips and tell him which final digit would result in the fewest winning tickets. If too many people had bet on combinations ending in a certain number, that's what Abba Dabba needed to avoid. So moments before the final race began, he would place massive, carefully calculated bets on select horses, wagers so large that they subtly shifted the final payouts. By nudging the total away from the numbers most Harlemites had played that day, Abba Dabba could quietly fix the winning number in his favour, ensuring that the smallest possible payout and the largest profit for Dutch was the outcome. It sounds impossible, and to most it was, but Berman's mind worked like a machine. He could adjust his wagers on the fly, balancing odds, payouts and pull totals in real time. When he demonstrated the system to Schultz in person at Coney Island, the Dutchman watched the math play out like clockwork. By the end of the week, Berman had proved his point and Schultz gave him the job. From that day forward, the policy racket became a fixed game. Not in the way people suspected, but in the smallest, most invisible way possible, by adjusting the arithmetic. Each day's random number was not chosen by luck or fate, but by one man with a pencil behind his ear and a racing form in his hand, and it worked beyond belief. When asked about it later, Bo Weinberg admitted that pretty near every day was a winning day. Schultz's annual income from the numbers racket tripled within a year. His profits had soared from $5 million to roughly $14 million, the equivalent of nearly $300 million a year in today's money. For Dutch, the fix was a revelation. Even if he secured St. Clair and Bumpy's bank during the war, he wouldn't have ever made this much money, and by December 1934, Dutch Schultz was rich beyond comprehension, but cornered. The Harlem War had cooled, his numbers racket was producing millions, and Abba Dabba Berman had turned chaos into an efficient machine. Yet, for all his wealth, the Dutchman couldn't buy peace of mind. His problem now wasn't a rival gangster, it was the law, and the law had a name: Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was a young, ruthless prosecutor who had made his career by doing what no one else dared, taking on the racketeers who had built empires during Prohibition. Schultz's tax records, his front businesses, his bank accounts, everything was being examined under Dewey's microscope. In 1935, Schultz was indicted for tax evasion. Dixie Davis managed to have the trial moved out of New York City to Syracuse, a quiet town in upstate New York where Dutch believed he could control the outcome. Acting on Dixie's advice, he spent lavishly, buying drinks for locals, throwing dinner parties, even helping small businesses with loans. By the time that the trial began, he practically owned the town. And sure enough, when the verdict came down, it was not guilty. But Dewey didn't relent. He had the trial relocated again, this time to a new jurisdiction where Dutch's influence couldn't reach. With this news, the Dutchman's empire was crumbling around him, and those closest to him could see it. Among them was Bo Weinberg, Schultz's right-hand man, the man who had ridden beside him through the Bronx beer war, who had been present at the killing of Mad Dog Coll, and who had enforced Schultz's rule across Harlem. Bo had been loyal for years, but loyalty was a dangerous currency when your boss was losing power. Weinberg had been meeting with Lucky Luciano, discussing how Schultz's rackets could be divided if Dewey finally brought him down. When word of this reached the Dutchman, there was no trial, no discussion, and no chance for explanation. Bo Weinberg was last seen leaving a Manhattan nightclub late one night. Schultz's men kidnapped him, threw him into a car, and drove him out towards the docks. Somewhere along the East River, they chained his legs, encased his feet in cement, and dumped him into the dark water. His body was never found. By October 1935, Dutch Schultz's world was shrinking fast. Thomas Dewey was closing in with another tax evasion case, and now even the mob's leadership had begun to view Schultz as a liability. He was reckless, unpredictable, and angrier than ever. And then came the decision that sealed his fate. Schultz, pacing and paranoid, proposed an idea that sent shockwaves through organised crime. He wanted to kill Thomas Dewey, not bribe him, not stall the case, kill him. He brought the plan to the Commission, the governing council of the American Mafia, newly formed under Lucky Luciano to keep peace and protect profits. The room was filled with men who had lived through the bloody chaos of the Castellamarese War just a few years earlier. They had built the commission precisely to avoid such madness. Schultz outlined his plan, calm but trembling with rage. Dewey was threatening their livelihoods, he said. If one bullet could solve the problem, why hesitate? The response was immediate and unanimous. No. Killing a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would bring an avalanche of police raids, federal investigations, and public fury. It would threaten every family, every racket, every dollar of mob money in the country. The commission told Schultz to stand down, but Dutch had never taken orders well. Furious, he stormed out of the meeting, declaring that with or without their approval, Dewey would be dead within 48 hours, and the commission couldn't afford to let a man like that live. That night, a quiet decision was made. Dutch Schultz had to die. On the rainy night of October the 23rd, 1935, Dutch Schultz was sitting in the Palace Chop House, a small steak restaurant at 12 East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey. Forced out of New York by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who had labelled him a public menace and ordered the NYPD to shoot him on sight, Newark had become his last refuge. Inside the chop house, the scene was ordinary: laughter, dinner plates, and the clinking of glasses. Schultz was in the back room with his men, Abba Dabba, his accountant, Abe Landau, his bodyguard, and Lulu Rosenkrantz, his driver and muscle. They had no idea that their killers were already outside. Two members of Murder Inc., the Mafia's murder-for-hire crew, Charles the Bug Workman and Mendy Weiss, entered quietly. Their guns were drawn. The room erupted in seconds. Shots tore through the tables. Landau, Berman and Rosenkrantz were hit instantly. Blood splattered the walls, but Schultz was nowhere to be seen. The Bug followed the sound of movement into the restroom, where he found the Dutchman. He fired twice. Schultz was hit with a rusty steel-jacketed 4.5 slug that crashed into his husky body just below the chest on the left and tore through the abdominal wall into the large intestine, gallbladder and liver before lodging on the floor near the urinal he had been using when the door opened. By the time the police arrived, the Palace Chop House was a massacre. Tables overturned, glasses shattered, and the Dutchman lay half-conscious on a table, bleeding from a stomach wound as paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher. He was rushed across the river to Newark City Hospital, still muttering incoherently. For almost 24 hours, he faded in and out of consciousness, mumbling to anyone who would listen whilst a stenographer took down his every word. The words didn't make sense, but they stuck. They were fragments from a man who had once terrified half of New York City. Whilst he lay dying, a Western Union telegram arrived at the hospital, and it read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." And it was signed, Madam, Queen of Policy. Dutch Schultz died the next day, aged 34, and the Palace Chop House murder sent shockwaves through New York's underworld. With 4 men dead, it was the biggest gangland killing since the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago 6 years earlier, and the question lingered, now Dutch was dead, who got his rackets? After Schultz's murder, the new order of the city's underworld fell quickly into place. Bumpy met with Lucky Luciano, and the 2 men reached an understanding. Harlem's numbers would continue, but under new management. The commission installed Trigger Mike Coppola, one of Luciano's lieutenants, to oversee operations, and Bumpy, ever the strategist, was made Harlem's caretaker. For the next 2 decades, Bumpy Johnson would rule as the undisputed godfather of Harlem. His influence stretched from the policy banks to the streets, his word carrying weight in every barbershop and nightclub uptown. But as time passed, his empire changed with the city. He became increasingly entangled in the drug trade, arrested more than 40 times on narcotics-related charges. Eventually, he was sentenced to 15 years on a heroin conspiracy conviction, serving much of it in Alcatraz. He was paroled in 1963, returning home to a Harlem that barely resembled the one he'd left. On July the 7th, 1968, just before 2 a.m, Bumpy Johnson collapsed from a heart attack while dining at Wells Restaurant, located at 2247 7th Avenue, today known as Lorraine's Place. He was 62 years old. Stephanie St. Clair, by then long retired, had passed her policy bank to Bumpy years earlier. She'd found a new purpose in politics and reform. In 1937, she married Sufi Abdul Hamid, the fiery labour and religious leader often called the Black Hitler for his passionate speeches. Together they campaigned against discriminatory hiring practices and housing segregation, but the marriage was short-lived. When St. Clair discovered Hamid's affair in early 1938, the confrontation ended violently. She shot him in a fit of rage and was sentenced to 10 years at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. After her release, she lived quietly but comfortably, investing wisely and continuing to write outspoken columns for the Amsterdam News. In her final years, she withdrew almost entirely from public life. In 1969, at the age of 82, Stephanie St. Clair died peacefully, just 12 months after Bumpy Johnson, who, by some accounts, had returned to live with her in his final year. Harlem mourned them both, 2 figures who had defined its streets for nearly half a century. Casper Holstein, the gentle Bito King who had once ruled before them all, turned his fortune towards philanthropy after being edged out of his policy empire by Dutch. He became a towering civic figure in Harlem, a major donor to black colleges, financing dormitories and schools, sponsoring writers, poets, and musicians during the Harlem Renaissance. He purchased the mortgage on the New York Hall of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, keeping it alive as a community hub even after Garvey's movement collapsed. Later, he developed the site into Holstein Court, a residential building for Harlem's professionals and business owners. In an era defined by vice and violence, Holstein left behind a legacy of dignity, proof that even the underworld could produce philanthropists. Alex Pompez, the baseball-loving banker, operated his cigar store peacefully for the rest of his life and returned full-time to the sport he loved. In 1948, sensing that baseball's integration would change everything, he transformed his New York Cubans into a minor league affiliate of the New York Giants. He would later serve on the Baseball Hall of Fame's Committee on Negro League Baseball in the early 1970s. Pompez died in 1974, aged 83, and was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. He was posthumously inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 2006, an extraordinary afterlife for a man who began his career running numbers in a Harlem cigar shop. The rest of the bankers, Willie Brunder, Henry Miro, Big Joe Eisen, they all retired quietly in the early 1940s, passing the torch to younger operators. They'd made their fortunes, bought their homes, and faded into respectability, living out their days as relics of a vanished age. Today, the Harlem numbers racket is a memory. The policy banks are gone, replaced by state lotteries and digital games of chance. Harlem streets, once alive with runners and bettors, are now filled with cafes, condos and music venues. Some of the old buildings that housed policy banks still remain, and though that racket is long gone, Harlem streets still hum with the same pulse. The same hustle that once turned dreams into numbers and numbers into power. Hoodlum told part of that story, the rest is still here, in the bricks, in the music, and in the heartbeat of Harlem itself. But just before we wrap up, and there was no way I could ever leave this out of the documentary, I just want to tell you a quick story that Dutch's lawyer Dixie Davis told before he died, and one that still fascinates many people, myself included, today. So a few weeks before Dutch's death, he was almost resigned to the fact that Dewey wouldn't stop until he was behind bars. So personally, having researched Dutch's life quite a lot in depth, as you can probably tell by all the books and everything, I don't actually think he was going to kill Dewey in 48 hours. I just think he was trying to get the commission, well, Lucky Luciano in particular, to show his hand and almost back him and eventually agree to whack Dewey to get him off Dutch's case, basically. Lucky owed Dutch a few favours because, long story short, the Castellamarese War, which I mentioned earlier in the documentary, was a war between two old mob bosses, and Lucky betrayed them both. I've got a full video on that, so watch it if you want to know the ins and outs. But that's why Lucky was now the head of the commission. It was something he created, and in order to gain trust of one of the mob bosses, Joe Mazzaria, Luciano had to combine both his empire and Joe's. At that point, Schultz threw in 30 speakeasies in the Bronx for Lucky to sweeten the deal with Joe. So their relationship, although they didn't really like each other, Dutch and Lucky this is, it was amicable, as Dutch was a huge force in his own right. He was one of the biggest mobsters in America, and they often did favours for each other. So going back to it, I just needed to give you a bit of backstory there, but going back to it, I don't actually think he was going to kill Dewey. He was just trying to convince Lucky and the others that this guy needed to go. And he was right, because after Dutch's death, Dewey was the man who put Lucky behind bars for 30 to 50 years and eventually deported him to Sicily, where he lived out his days virtually powerless. Anyway, I'll get to it in a minute. Dixie tells a story that when Dutch resigned himself to his own fate, he ordered Lulu and Abe to empty his safety deposit boxes across Manhattan, and then Schultz obtained a 3-foot steel strongbox and stuffed it with all his cash, bonds, diamonds, jewels, everything, as much as it could hold. Dixie estimates it was around $7 million in total then, which a large proportion of that coming from his bloody booze profits, but you can bet that a huge amount also came from the numbers game. If it was $7 million back in 1935, it'd be worth over $165 million today. So once it was all in the box and he had the deposit, it took 4 of them to lift it, apparently, and then him and Lulu Rosenkrantz, which is the guy who Dutch Schultz trusted the most, drove it to an area near Phoenicia in New York, where the two supposedly buried it in a place near Esopus Creek. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'll show it on a map now anyway. Schultz's bootlegging operation had run through the Catskills, which made this area familiar to Schultz and his cronies, so they buried it and then marked it next to a tree that they carved in an X, and Schultz drew a map, swearing Lulu to never tell a soul, but Lulu couldn't keep his mouth shut, and rumours of the treasure circled for years. So treasure hunters still seek it today, and without spoiling it, some progress has been found, which was documented in PBS's series Secrets of the Dead, with an episode focused entirely on Dutch's treasure called Gangster's Gold. I really enjoyed it. I've watched it quite a few times. I'm a bit of a Dutch Schultz historian, if you can call it that. Basically, he's just the guy who fascinates me the most because of how bonkers he was. But yeah, if you like my content, you'll love that. I'm gonna link it in a YouTube comment. I don't get anything from it or anything like that. It's just a great episode and adds something that I couldn't not mention in this documentary. But anyway, enough waffling. I just thought I'd recommend that to you. Anyway, thanks so much for watching the video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and please feel free to join the Discord server. As always, I'll leave a comment. Well, I can't leave another comment. The Discord server you can join by clicking this link here, which I'm going to put on the screen, so just pretend there's a link there. It's great. It's where we'll talk about all things like, you know, the episode, PBS's Gangster's Gold, plus so much more. So join if you want to get involved in the conversation. If not, I'll let you go now. Check out PBS's Gangster Gold, Secrets of the Dead episode. Fantastic. And one day I hope I'll be the guy to find the treasure. But anyway, in the meantime, thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next one.